Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Alexander Bohr. He is a postdoc at the Central European University Democracy Institute's research group on the and Re-Democratization and a visiting professor at CEU Vienna. He received an MA in Political Science at the CEU in 2012 and a PhD in Political Science at Aarhus University in 2018, where he also worked as a postdoc until 2022. His research focuses on how the human mind navigates social and political challenges like political polarization, online political hostility, the COVID-19 pandemic, or selecting and evaluating political leaders. His work integrates insights from political behavior, social and evolutionary psychology, and public health. And apart from that, I would just like to mention that he was part of two large projects supported by the Carlsberg Foundation, the ROPH, Research on Online Political Hostility project, where they investigate the causes and consequences of hostility and fake news sharing in online political discussions, and the HOPE, HOPE, How Democracies Cope with COVID-19, where they monitor how societies respond to the coronavirus pandemic. And today we're going to talk a little bit about all of that. So, Dr. Bohr, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with online political hostility. So first of all, I've already talked, of course, a little bit about this with other people on the show, like Sasha Altai, Sander van der Linden, and others. What predicts the sharing of fake news on social media and particularly Twitter?
Right. So, what our research have done on this question is basically trying to combine two tools which usually are kept separate in this research domain, and one is actual behavioral data from Twitter, who is sharing what types of news, and the other is validated, psychometrically validated psychological scales. So basically what we did in this research is hire a bunch of respondents who are on Twitter, Americans, US Americans, and ask them questions in surveys about their psychological dispositions and attitudes, but also link this data to their Twitter behavior. So we were able to have like this broad picture of the psychological differences between the people who share news and share misinformation and those who don't. And we were thinking in terms of three broad categories, which previous research has discussed that could contribute to the sharing of misinformation. And one is a broad topic related to ignorance, right? That it basically says that these people just like are not very literate. They don't really know their way around the internet. They are old. They're confused. They're not very reflective cognitively, right? So that's one group of variables. The second group is related to theories of disruption. So the idea here is there are some people who just like to cause chaos, right? So trolls, right, are these kind of folks, right? So they cause harm for fun on a more political domain. We are often talk about cynicism, right? People who think that like the whole politics is corrupt and politicians are not really looking after the people's good. So these are the concepts related to disruption. And the third broader group of variables which we looked at was polarization, right? So here the idea is that particularly in the United States, there are these two big political camps, Democrats and Republicans, and increasingly they really don't like each other, right? So there are positive and negative aspects of this, right? You like your in-group and you dislike your outgroup. And we used all these different variables to look into both who is sharing misinformation and who's not, and who's sharing news, like mainstream political news, and who's not. And what we found that all of these matter to some extent, right? So, but the strongest influence in our data is wielded by polarization, and particularly outgroup negative effect. So the people who share the most misinformation are those who hate the out party, who hate the other party, right? And in particular, because there's this known asymmetry in the United States that Republicans share most misinformation, it is the biggest offenders of misinformation sharing are Republicans, or like people who hate the Democrats. But it's kind of interesting, I think, maybe I can add that we didn't find a stark difference between the sharing of news and the sharing of misinformation, so mainstream and misinformation, right? And maybe that makes sense if we try to think with the mind of actual citizens, right? For us researchers, it's like we get the data set where things are labeled as misinformation and the mainstream news, and we are like extremely literate about these things. So we are prone to think about these as different animals. But from a regular user, it's not black and white. It's a scale, right? It's like all gray, and we've seen that the same people who are sharing a lot of misinformation are actually also sharing a lot of mainstream news and a lot of hyper-partisan news, right? So there is this interesting continuum between misinformation and fake news and mainstream news from the user's perspective.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to partisan polarization, particularly, this is a very interesting phenomenon, and people have been studying it a lot, of course, in the context of the US. But when it comes to that topic, what kinds of questions are you mostly interested in?
Well, basically, I'm interested, there like partisan polarization and like societal polarization, right? Like conflicts between different factions and groups in society. I think it's a very juicy research topic, and we know it's like both decision makers and regular people are concerned about this topic. And of course, most of the research focuses on the US, but it's by no means limited to the United States. Yeah. So I just recently moved home to Hungary and joined the Democracy Institute, and one of the current research interests that I have is related to polarization in Hungary, which is also an extremely polarized country, and how basically polarization does not only contribute potentially to various forms of hostility, right, and sharing misinformation and hostile rumors, but also to reduce support for democracy, right? So like democratic backsliding is an issue in Hungary, and we see that like once different camps in society become very antagonistic, the rules of the democratic game are increasingly more and more easily violated, and that's my current interest, for example.
Mm-hmm. And talking specifically about online political hostility, what does the term refer to exactly, and what explains the phenomenon?
Right. I mean, it depends, I guess. The project I was working on, ROPH, which we pronounce rough with a bit of freedom of interpretation. There we were thinking about hostility very broadly, right, in the project. So we think misinformation is a form of hostility, sharing misinformation, right? also like rumors which may not need to resemble like news and misinformation. That's also another form of political hostility. Of course, there is a link between online and offline political hostility, and like organizing violent protests and these kind of stuff are also online political hostility. But in a more narrow sense, we have a paper which looks into specifically offensive and harmful comments in political discussions. So these are these are discussions about politics broadly defined, social issues, right, and between citizens, regular lay people, and we know that some like quite often these discussions don't go very well, right? To say the least. There were these beautiful hopes that once the internet will enable everyone to join the democratic discussion, will just like level society, and we won't need gatekeepers anymore. All right, everyone can say what they want, and instead, what seems to be happening is that everyone is like agreeing that discussions about politics and social issues on the internet are particularly toxic in civil, often offensive and harmful, and we really try to understand why that's the case.
And so, why do some people share offensive statements on the internet?
Right. So it's a great question, and there is a very popular answer to it, which we called the mismatch hypothesis, building on this evolutionary psychological idea that our mind has evolved to do certain things, and when you give it cues which are extremely different from the environment where it evolved, then it's going to cause trouble, right? So our love of sugars, right, is a good example of mismatch. Like sugar used to be very rare, now it's the supermarket is full of sugar, so we are becoming increasingly obese. And basically we can translate this idea to the online political hostility, right? Because we discussed a lot that actually. Of course, we are evolved to face-to-face interactions, right? That's what we are used to, and there are few important things about these face-to-face interactions, which were dominant before internet, right? They are between people who usually know each other, right? There is reputation. It's very rich in nonverbal cues, right? They're like, I'm not just talking, I'm using my face, my hand, and of course we are in the same physical space. So like, I know that if I make you very angry, you might want to slap me, right? So, and then of course the internet is extremely different from that. It's extremely easy to be anonymous on the internet, right? Yeah. To completely conceal who you are, not to worry about reputation at all. It's extremely, the cues are not rich at all, right? We have very often only text, not even voice, and no non-verbal cues. So the idea goes that, well, it's just, there's something about the internet which makes people hostile or jerks. There is this meme, the gift hypothesis. It's not very professional, so we didn't use it in the paper, but I really like it. It's the greater internet fuckwad theory, which is this little cartoon which says that a normal person plus anonymity plus audience equals jerk. Essentially, right? So we basically went out to test this theory. Is this really the case that people who are who have an easy time keeping their cool and being civil in face-to-face offline interactions more often get into trouble, so to speak, on the internet? And to be honest, to our surprise, we found basically no convincing evidence for this theory. Right? So what we found was an extremely high correspondence between acts of political hostility online and offline. So the same people who admit to be offensive, to be harmful, to make offensive jokes. We measure the broad range of behaviors from offensive jokes to actually harassment. And we don't find either a qualitative or a quantitative asymmetry between online and offline spaces. So basically, who is offensive then? Well, we again used various psychological measures, and the most important, which stood out for us, was this concept called status-driven risk-taking. And basically, the idea here is that there are people who are willing to do risky stuff to get status. So the items in the scale are including like, oh, I would risk my life to get a huge sum of money, or I would enjoy being famous even if it meant that I could get assassinated, right? And of course, very few people are all out enthused about this kind of statement, but there is a nice distribution of people. Like some people would entertain the idea of participating in a risky medical experiment if it meant $1 million cash, and others are not at all. And what we find is that people who are higher on this status-driven risk-taking scale are more interested in politics in general, and they're also much more often offensive in these discussions than those who are low in this status-driven risk-taking.
So, in this case, to understand online political hostility, it's better to look at individual psychology. Is that it, or?
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting because, of course, there are different ways to look at this. And some of the influential previous research looked at temporal differences, like when are you more hostile? And then they found that when people are tired, for example, then they're more hostile. And then there was the bottom line was, anyone can become a troll, right? And of course, we are looking at a slightly different research question, but what we find is that indeed there are just some people who are more predisposed to be offensive. It doesn't mean that they are offensive in all the time. In general, we've looked at the U.S. and Denmark in this research, and we find that as one would imagine, maybe in the U.S. people are more offensive on average than in Denmark. But even in the US, most people are like occasional violators of norms, right? There are very few people who are offensive all the time, which makes good sense, perhaps. But still, there are important interpersonal differences, predispositions in who is offensive. And I think that has important implications for how to solve this problem, because a lot of the current discussions are talking about like algorithms and platforms, right? And of course, it's easier to change an algorithm than to change humans. But our research implies that it might indeed be fruitful to think that, okay, maybe we need social media platforms to identify people and ban certain people, even though it, of course, violates like ideals of freedom of speech. And it kind of also means that, like, if we see an increase in hostility, which, I mean, we may or may not be seeing, it depends on the place and the time scale, but very often I think online hostility is like a mirror into social problems. And of course, politicians like to talk about the responsibility of the platforms, right? But in a sense, sometimes maybe the trouble is bigger, and there are like these real social tensions which need to be addressed to completely remove the problem and not just the symptoms, so to speak.
So let's talk now about the work you've done on the COVID-19 pandemic and several of its political and psychological aspects. So, of course, this has been a prolonged health crisis. It's still ongoing, really, but anyway, even the part during which we were in lockdowns and there were lots of restrictions in place, it went for 2 years or something like that. So it was very complicated for many people. The people have been using the term pandemic fatigue and others like that. So from what you've studied, how can health authorities motivate the public with health advice during prolonged health crises like COVID-19, for example?
Right. So, I mean, it's an interesting question to what extent authorities can influence stuff. I think a lot of it boils down to how people are and how people behave. But of course, again, that's very difficult to change. Whereas as advising authorities is easier. So I completely understand the interest in that question. And it's kind of funny because the way we ended up doing research on the COVID pandemic was that our PI, our principal investigator, Michael Bank-Petersen, wrote an essay early in the pandemic in a Danish newspaper, which then got translated into a bunch of languages, and I helped to translate and basically translate both in a literal sense and in a cultural sense for a Hungarian context. And basically the title of the essay was that the unpleasant truth is the best protection against the coronavirus. And I think that, and basically the idea was that this is like February of 2020, when everyone was downplaying the coronavirus, right? Like, it's we know about it, but you don't have to worry, it's going to be fine. And of course, very soon we realized that it was not going to be fine, but there was this reaction and instinctive reaction from many authorities, and I think like political leaders are worse at this than health authorities, right? Trump has explicitly admitted that he was downplaying it. But there's this paternalistic instinct that, like, we shouldn't make people worried, right? Like, and of course that led to terrible consequences because the sooner people were told that this is actually a major concern, the more severe the pandemic got. So one of the broad themes which emerged again and again in our work was to treat citizens as adults, basically. The job of the health authorities, in our view, is to empower people, right? To be honest and use transparent communication, to build trust, and to build self-efficacy, so to speak. These feelings that actually there's a problem. Let's be honest, but you can do something, and it's in your power to solve this or to make it better, even though the pandemic is this huge thing in the entire globe, right? So it seemed to matter a little what I do as an individual, right? And it can be pretty suffocating. But I think an important thing which with the health authorities needed to do is to say like, no, actually it matters what you do, and please do, and please distance, and please vaccinate. So that's what they should do. What they shouldn't do probably, or to be very careful about doing is to antagonizing and moralizing the issue. I think it's a much more dangerous tool because it can be effective in the short term, but it also leads to all sorts of troubles down the line, which we may discuss, I guess.
Yes, we will get into the moralization part as well later on. But before that, when it comes to making people comply to the health advice given by the health authorities, does fear work?
Right. Oh, it does. It's a very good motivator in a sense, right? I mean, we've seen it throughout the pandemic, and of course, as you say, it like we were lucky to get a grant very early in March of 2020, and then we were doing very intense work for like 2.5 years. So when we started, and basically we worked throughout the different phases of the pandemic. So when we started, our primary interest was physical distancing and like lockdowns, right? That was what we did in the spring of 2020, at least in most countries. Right. Definitely in Denmark, where I was based. And we were wondering like, okay, who is keeping distance, physical distance, right? Who is observing the hygiene requirements? And we found that, like, as we know from prior literature, that like people who are concerned about the pandemic, people who are more affected personally, which meant the elderly, particularly in this pandemic, they were very good at complying with the health advice. But then again, appealing to fear has its limits, right? We know that it has important mental health costs, right? Like if you just like terrify people, they can get extremely anxious, depressed. It of course also has these potential costs in terms of increasing the acceptance of undemocratic treatments of other groups. So we were thinking, okay, the fear route is clear, but is there another route? And indeed, we found that there is, and that route is about, again, self-efficacy, which is basically a part of knowledge, right, about how specific measures can protect against COVID-19.
Yeah.
But also, it's not just knowing what to do, but also feeling capable of following that advice. So if I know what to do and I know that I can do that, it really helped people to comply. And we measured these things again in surveys and found that those who have the knowledge and those who have these feelings of self-efficacy were very compliant. And an interesting thing which we found is that those who have these high levels of self-efficacy don't need fear, which is seems like a normatively desirable place to be, right? Like you don't have to be concerned. Maybe the levels of infection are not very high in your area. Maybe you're personally not at risk because you're young and healthy, right? So even if you're not concerned specifically, maybe the health maybe you think rightly or wrongly that the health system is doing an excellent job, which was the case in some places more than others. So even if you're not concerned, but you think you know what to do and you feel capable of doing that, then they did comply, which seems like a particularly sweet place to be.
And what about when it comes to communicating hope? Can that work? And if so, how should health authorities and governments go about doing it?
Right. Yes. So this question about hope came up sometime in late 2020 or early 21. It's the name of the project, funnily enough. But also If you recall, there was this the big first wave usually, right? And then things were getting kind of better, and then the variants started to come in. And basically, and our research project, we were like this work group of political scientists doing survey research, but we also had different units within the project in different universities of social media experts and actually data scientists. And when we saw that the variants are coming, we realized that, and we were also monitoring societies across 8 countries, and we saw that, like, okay, people know that alpha back then is here, but they are not so concerned about it, and they don't feel that they need to change their behavior, right? I mean, if there was no alpha by some miracle, right, maybe we would have had it over by then. So the idea was to say, okay, we need to warn people, like find a way to warn people, but then what should the message be? And it was a super exciting project with very different, very interdisciplinary, large group. And basically, the people who know how to model the epidemic used actual epidemic models to come up with the modified version of the famous flatten the curve graph. And we basically, and a professional designer drew two versions of this graph. One was what we call the threat condition, which showed that, well, the level of hospitalization is going down right now, and it would go down if there was no new variant, right? But unfortunately, there is one. And what we predict to happen is that hospitalization is going to skyrocket, and it will surpass the health system capacity very soon. And we need stronger preventive measures to address the situation. So that was the threat condition, to say, well, there's going to be huge trouble unless we act. And then there was another version of this message, which basically drew the entire curve, which was like, okay, indeed, it starts like half of it is the same. It was going to be fine. It's going to skyrocket because of the new variant unless we act, and we need to act to keep hospitalization levels below the capacity of the healthcare system. But indeed, there is hope, because once that curve is going to drop at the end, hospitalizations will go down. And basically, what we did was went out and measured the effects of these different types of communications, and in a sense, both of these helped a little. In a sense, both of these increased somewhat people's perceptions that strong measures are required. Both of them increased. Let me remember. Yeah. Both. Yeah. But importantly, the hope message worked much better, because it led to a bigger increase in how much support there was for strict, stringent policies. It increased how much people believe that we will be safely getting through this new wave. And it also slightly more increased the presumed adherence to guidelines. So it seems that, again, authorities don't only need to scare people, but to provide hope, right? And I think it rhymes well with the previous research that you can do this and it's going to be fine. It's an important part of the message.
Mm-hmm. What about the acceptance of COVID-19 vaccines? Did you study any specific, for example, individual factors that predicted it?
Absolutely. So this is a literature, and it has been even before the pandemic, of course. And there are these different taxonomies or nomenclatures of like 5A or 5C or 7C of like different factors, because it's like an extremely complex question, right? What matters and what does not. We also, and of course, I mean, it might depend a bit whether we are talking about like a seasonal flu shot or some of these vaccines which you need to get in childhood or COVID-19, right? So I thought it would be interesting to look at COVID-19 vaccination specifically across 8 different countries, mostly in the West, and we looked at 4 big groups of factors. One is related to confidence, and that basically trust in various institutions and agencies, so like trust in national health authorities and scientists and governments, and we found that this matters a lot. This is probably like the strongest factor that we found, like whether you think that you can trust your health authorities and whether you think you can trust the scientists who develop these vaccines matters a huge deal. Then there is the question of vulnerability, let's say, right? So it's kind of related to your personal health, your concerns about your own well-being, right? Like how vulnerable you are as a person, and this matters also for pretty much, right? So again, as always, we find that like older people were like very eager to get the vaccine. People who are concerned for themselves and their family were pretty eager to get the vaccine. And then the last 2 groups, which still had an effect, but smaller. And of course, maybe I should be more careful about saying a fact. These are correlational stuff. So basically, we are looking at groups of people and differences across groups. We're not manipulating these factors. But what we find is that personal constraints, right, which means like, okay, how much how easy it is for you to get the vaccine, which very often is not your own decision, right? But the situation of the healthcare system and your situation in life, whether you can afford, right? How much you follow, how much you changed your behavior in the pandemic and follow other types of advice. This matters somewhat too. And the final is about collective responsibility, which is basically concern for the community, right? Like how much you think that the hospitals are able to help the sick, how much you trust other people, and this kind of stuff. And that also had some, but like smaller influence. And then of course, the $1 million question is, which one of these are amendable, right? How can you change, or what can you change, right? And in a sense, and that's a question which we didn't really wasn't able to go deep into. We were looking at differences between groups, but then it kind of gets tricky, right? Because I mean, can you build trust in the health authorities in a matter of months, right? I mean, maybe you can try, but it's very hard, especially if you have some groups who had like 30 years of bad experience with the health agencies. Whereas like making the vaccine extremely easy to access, right? Remove any constraints and basically just like, if you show up, you get the jab and that's it. No need to register. And these are easier things to do. Even if by in the big scheme of things, they have a smaller effect. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is a very important one, but I just wanted to preface it by saying that COVID-19 vaccines are extremely safe and everyone should take them. The adverse side effects, particularly the most severe ones, are very rare. So, but okay, but the question is, still all medications have negative features and some side effects. So, after the vaccines came out, should governments have communicated transparently about them?
Yeah. So I completely agree about the important disclaimer. And indeed, I would want to note that I think like some side effects were there as well, but also an important difference was in terms of their effectiveness, right? So decision makers had the dilemma in a sense, right? We've been extremely lucky that vaccines have been developed very quickly, and many of these vaccines have been extremely effective. Some of them have been still pretty effective, but less so, right? And some of them had small side effects, others almost no side effects. And from a social perspective, from the perspective of decision makers, right? You want as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. It's extremely important that whenever there is a free vaccine, someone goes there and gets it. But of course, from the individual's perspective, it's a bit more complicated. And some people were prone to say, okay, maybe I'm not eligible for these fancy new mRNA vaccines just yet, but I don't want to take these slightly less effective, teeny tiny bit more larger side effect alternative vaccine. I'll just wait for 2 months for the best possible vaccine. And of course, from the community's perspective, that's terrible. Right, because even if the effectiveness on your personal is like slightly less lower, it can make a big positive effect on the community level to reduce this transmission change. And we were thinking about, okay, what should decision makers do in this situation? And again, there are these paternalistic instincts in some decision makers to say like, okay, I'm going to withhold information. I'll just like say something vaguely reassuring. It's fine, please take it. It's the best thing, which is true, right? But it can be a bit mushy. Whereas the alternative is to say, hey, okay, there's this alternative vaccine. Admittedly, it's a bit less effective. Admittedly, it has slightly higher side effects. We were benchmarking in our experiment to seasonal flu vaccines because, of course, people have no idea about actual numbers, right? So an alternative method is to say, okay, vaguely reassure that please do this. It's the best. I won't tell you how good it is or bad, but it's fine, believe me. Or to say, please do this. It helps the community, even though it's slightly less effective, slightly more side effects. And what we find is that the transparent communication is usually better, even if it involves admitting that something is that vaccine is slightly more. Even if the information is slightly negative, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of vaccine acceptance, and so this is one, again, a research which we've done in the US and in Denmark, but the results are broadly similar. What we see is that there isn't a huge negative cost. There's not a huge cost to being transparent about the negative effects. So compared to a control condition, both being vague and reassuring and being transparent about negative effects reduces the acceptance of the vaccine. There is just, what can you do about it, right? And then transparent negative is a bit worse than a vague reassuring message, but not by much. But then there is a real benefit to being transparent compared to using vague messages. And part of it comes from endorsements of conspiracies. So once you start to be mushy as a health authority, like conspiratorial thinking goes up. Like people realize, like, okay, they are not telling me something that sounds terrible, right? And vague messages have this effect, whereas transparent messages, whether they're positive or negative, don't. And perhaps even more importantly, vague messages reduce trust in the health authorities, whereas even negative transparent messages build trust. So we think, so our conclusion was that given that this pandemic is a long thing, right? It's a long game. It's best to be transparent, even if it means telling hard news in the moment, because that's the way to avoid this spiral of distrust and conspiratorial thinking, which might make your life much harder down the line.
Mm-hmm. So let's get now into the moralization aspect of things we've teased earlier. So at a certain point, the COVID-19 pandemic were no longer just a scientific, public health and medical issue, but also a moral one. So how did that happen, and what predicted the moralization of the pandemic and the health advice associated with it?
Right. Yes, so an interesting thing has been that most of the research was looking at top-down processes, right? So what the authorities are saying and doing, right? How they inform the citizens, how they restrict, like how they introduce restrictions and this kind of stuff, right? And of course, that's part of the picture and an important part. But we argue that the immense behavioral change which we witnessed, like people started physically distance from like one day to another, right? In many countries, would not have happened if these processes were not supported by bottom-up forces. And basically, what we're saying, meaning by that, is that especially in Western democratic countries, these rules are not enforced by the authorities, right? There is no policeman in every corner restricting you to go down the street. And even if there were like these very special and short times where there are no police who is looking at face mask use, vaccination remains a voluntary thing in many countries, and still we see that huge parts of society are complying. and what we are thinking that, okay, we know that humans do this sometimes, right? They do these huge large-scale cooperations, and part of how that happens is to making moralized appeals, to basically say that, okay, here's behavior, it is the good thing to do, and if you break this norm, it's bad, right? And it's not only bad, but if you are a norm breaker, you deserve of punishment. And this is a very instinctive, spontaneous thing that humans do, and we know that it's an important part of all sorts of behavioral change, right? So, like a famous example is smoking. Right? We kind of knew that smoking is not great back in 60s, I guess, when these happened, and still people kept on smoking and exposing others to secondhand smoking, right? But then, when smoking got moralized and said, it's like, okay, it's bad to expose others to secondhand smoke, and you deserve condemnation if you do. Then we saw this big behavioral change in how society, how society was organized. And basically we were saying like, okay, it seems that the pandemic can be a topic where behaviors get moralized, where behaviors get this tag that, okay, this is the good and right thing to do, and if you don't do that, then you're worthy of condemnation, you deserve punishment. And basically, perhaps more important is like a behavioral descriptive finding which we had, which again we used these 8 country surveys which we were fielding periodically, and demonstrated that very early on in the pandemic, in all countries, large majorities of society thought about behaviors, protective behaviors in the pandemic in these moralized terms, right? So they were thinking that like, well, if you don't follow the advice, then you deserve condemnation. And also the other part of this is to say like, okay, lay people is partly to blame for the pandemic, right? So if we have a tough situation with the pandemic, it's partly because people just don't follow the advice, and it happened pretty early, and there are some differences across countries. There's also some fluctuation in time, but it was pretty strong across all countries and all periods, and we've did a follow-up with vaccination pretty early on. And we found that vaccination also emerged as this moralized topic. That it is your duty, it is the good thing to do to get vaccinated.
Mm-hmm. And about that last bit, it seems that there was also prejudice, both against the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. So how and why did that happen?
Right. So it's an interesting question to what extent moralization is a good thing or a bad thing, right? There was this very interesting good paper which was published just at the beginning of the pandemic by Korn and colleagues, which basically demonstrated that people are very easily, intuitively think about vaccination as a social contract. Right. Again, that's like this moralized concept that we all do this little thing, and then we get a big social benefit, and it basically leads to the implication that maybe that's what we should do. People like we should remind them that it's a social contract; it's your duty to do so, and their evidence is basically showing that, well, people who break the social contract, like people think that the unvaccinated, those who break this social contract, basically deserve less generosity. Like, I'm going to withhold some generosity from you, and that seems fine, right? I mean, generosity is a voluntary thing. We are generous with those who follow the contract. And if you don't follow, then I won't be generous to you. And that seems fine. Like that's normatively okay thing, I think. But then, and again, we kind of think that moralization helped to lock in these new norms about physical distancing. So in a sense, there is this good part of moralization that it motivates new behaviors and helps to coordinate with big groups. Yeah. But then there seems to be also a cost of this moralization, and that's what our new paper looks into, because we found that like part of this moralized rhetoric was pretty strong language against the unvaccinated, even from people who very rarely use strong language, right? So like the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, said that, "Oh, I want to piss off the unvaccinated," right? the Danish prime minister also had like a press conference where she just went off script and used very strong language against the unvaccinated. And so it seemed that there is a lot of anger at the unvaccinated. And meanwhile, there were a lot of reports about the unvaccinated also being angry, right, and going into protests and propagating various conspiracy theories, right, about the negative, completely false negative effects of vaccines. So we were thinking like, okay, there seems to be a tension in society along these lines, and we went out and collected data in 21 countries around the globe, and basically use these all social psychological paradigm about prejudice or discriminatory attitudes in family relations, right? So basically, the question is like, how would you feel if someone who is unvaccinated married someone in your family? And we had a pretty elaborate experimental paradigm, but that's the important bit to figure out whether people are unhappy if someone from the vaccination out group joins their family. And we think the family is an important domain because you have control about how your family relations, right? And indeed, what we found is a completely asymmetrical relationship where vaccinated people exhibited very high levels of prejudice against the unvaccinated. It was higher on average than against immigrants from the Middle East, which is quite surprising. We had this benchmark group, which we know suffers from a lot of discrimination. And we found that indeed vaccinated people are very unhappy if someone who is vaccinated joins their family. They think vaccinated people think that unvaccinated are untrustworthy, are incompetent, and of course they fear of getting infected from unvaccinated people, which is understandable. But it's completely asymmetric because meanwhile the unvaccinated didn't show any prejudice in this study against the vaccinated. So yeah, and we found that this prejudice is higher in countries where fewer people died of COVID, and which have tighter cultures, where social norms are more strict and more strictly enforced by people. And then we had some follow-up studies where we showed that these discriminatory attitudes or prejudice, if you will, is not limited to the family relations, where there's a bigger concern about infections. It works with more abstract others, and it's not limited to just negative emotions. It also extends to support for restrictions of democratic freedoms, at least in the United States. And it's also large, not only compared to immigrants, but also to other disadvantaged groups like drug addicts and people who have been in prison, and so on and so forth.
So, as a last topic, I would like to ask you 2 or 3 questions about the broader social and political effects of COVID. So, did the pandemic also have any institutional effects? Like, for example, did it contribute in some way to the erosion of system support?
Right. Yes. So we are political scientists, and in our group, even though we did a lot of work on compliance and this kind of stuff, we also wanted to investigate these broader effects of political attitudes and social relations. And And indeed, it's kind of interesting because a lot of the early research on this have been focusing on these rally around the flag effects, right? That like very early in the pandemic, when people realized that there's this big trouble, as usual, the support for the incumbent kind of spiked. That okay, you're the boss, we are behind you, show us the way out, basically, right? And we kind of took a longer perspective. We collected data throughout the first year of the pandemic, so in three waves, in the spring, summer, and late winter of 2020. And we were looking into these broad institutional effects, right? So like how much people think that their country is a democracy, and that's a well-functioning democracy. How much they support the political system. And we found that across 4 countries, which we studied here, which was Denmark, Hungary, Italy, and the US, these system support was decreasing throughout the first year of the pandemic, and not only, and pretty consistently across the 4 countries, and the various measures which we used in this broad topic. And indeed, on the micro level, we saw that the people who were particularly suffering from the effects of the pandemic across various domains, from mental health to economic effects to social isolation, the people who are suffering the most were most likely to withdraw their system support, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And this stands in stark contrast with another broad group of variables which we looked into about social solidarity, mm-hmm. Right? Because, well, it makes sense that, well, I mean, there's this huge role that the state and various authorities were playing during the pandemic, right? I mean, they were informing the society, they were restricting a lot of democratic rights, which might not have been restricted ever in citizens' lifetime. Mm-hmm. So it kind of makes sense that, like, well, after you've been in the pandemic for 10 months, your support for the system kind of is buckling, especially if you think that it's been terrible. But then, again, as we saw, that there's this huge social aspect of the pandemic, right? How much can you trust other people, and to what extent do we need to use surveillance to see what others are doing, and this kind of stuff? How much should we support them? And we thought that this could also be that the pandemic might have some negative effects here as well. But actually, we don't see any convincing clear trends here. There are some stuff which go down, but others go up surprisingly across countries and the variables. And also on the individual level, there doesn't seem to be this systematic relationship that when you suffer more from the pandemic, then your social solidarity is going down. So it's mostly about the system and the state, it appears.
Mm-hmm. So just one last question then. Apart from anti-systemic attitudes that might have derived from the psychological burden of the pandemic, have you also studied political violence? Is political violence, or has it been associated with it as well?
Absolutely, we did. And it complements this picture very well, and it's a particularly proud moment as a researcher for us, because we included in the second round of this research some items about radicalized intentions. To what extent you think it's okay to go down and participate in radical protests and political violence. And we were able to come out with a preprint before the attack on the U.S. Capitol in January, saying that, okay, our research shows that among the people who suffer from the highest psychological burden of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's also this increased support for political violence and an increased radicalization intention, so to speak, and increased support for anti-systemic attitudes. And actually, we found it across all countries that we studied, again, these 4 countries. So, of course, it didn't mean that political violence was a thing in all countries. You need, right, more than intentions and attitudes for violence to actually happen. But we found that even if it didn't explode in some places, the fuel has been accumulating because of the pandemic. And indeed, we have a more recent paper which links again these types of various measures of political discontent from supporting protests and not supporting the system, and linking that to feelings of fatigue in the later stages of the pandemic. And again, we found that the people who feel that they can't keep up with the pandemic anymore, well, felt, I guess, were more likely to say that it's okay to protest and we shouldn't support the system. So it's kind of interesting because the data collection has now ended, and we seem to have moved past the pandemic by now. Even though at the time we stopped, we still found plenty of tensions and negative attitudes, and it's an interesting question for the future whether as public interest in the pandemic reduces and hopefully actual exposure and sickness goes down, whether these things just disappear or whether they will stay with us.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Bohr, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet? And also, if you want the opportunity to tell us about the stuff you're working on at the moment, any future projects?
Right. I'm on Twitter still, even though Twitter seems to be ending as we know it. But I'm at Bohr Alexander 1 on Twitter. I also have a website, alexanderbohr.github.com, I believe. No, alexanderbohr.github.io. And now I'm here at the Democracy Institute, which means that I'm increasingly interested in and re-democratization, right? Like why some countries who have been democratic at one point are struggling to keep that democracy, and why there is actually a lot of support for certain leaders who are eroding democracy. That's one of my big preoccupations at the moment. So I hope I'll find out something, and maybe then I can come back and tell you about it.
For sure. That's what I was going to say. First of all, thank you so much for coming on the show and for your time. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and I would be very happy to have you on again somewhere in the future to talk about the work you've just mentioned.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. It's been a pleasure.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to help keep the channel sustainable, please pay a visit to my Patreon page or to PayPal. You have all of the links there in the description box. Even just $1 would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. Finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pereira Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Vissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whitting, Bordano Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henrik Alenia, John Collars, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormer, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslan Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yassila Dez Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Alec Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, and Dr. Bird. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Thomas Trumbull. And my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.